The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves across Millbrook University's sprawling campus as demolition crews prepared to tear down Henderson Hall, the aging dormitory that had housed thousands of students since it was October 2023, and the building's time had finally come to an end. Another casualty of the university's ambitious modernization project. What no one expected was that the crumbling walls would surrender a secret that had been buried for nearly 3 decades. Inside the thick plaster walls of room 314, wedged between wooden studs and wrapped in a plastic shopping bag that had somehow survived the passage of time, lay a leather-bound diary. Its pages, yellowed but remarkably preserved, contained the intimate thoughts and growing fears of 18-year-old Jessica Marie Holloway, a girl who had vanished without a trace on the night of November 6th. Jessica's disappearance had once dominated headlines across the Midwest. Her face, with its gentle smile and bright hazel eyes, had stared back from missing person flyers that papered telephone poles and store windows for months after she vanished. But as seasons turned to years and years stretched into decades, the case had grown cold. The investigation files gathered dust in storage. The search parties disbanded. The hope that once burned bright in her family's hearts dimmed to barely glowing embers. Until now, the discovery of Jessica's diary would reignite not just the investigation, but questions that cut to the very heart of what happened during those final terrifying weeks of her life. The pages revealed a young woman living in fear, documenting strange incidents that escalated with each passing day, and ultimately pointing toward a truth far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. To understand the significance of what was found in those walls, one must first return to the autumn of 1996, when Jessica Holloway was just another college freshman trying to find her place in the world. Millbrook University sat like a jewel in the heart of rural Ohio, its red brick buildings and tree-lined walkways embodying the quintessential American college experience. For Jessica, who had grown up in the small town of Cedar Falls 2 hours south, the university represented freedom, possibility, and the chance to reinvent herself away from the suffocating familiarity of home. She had arrived on campus in late August with 2 duffel bags, a crate of books and dreams that seemed as vast as the Ohio sky. Her parents, Thomas and Linda Holloway, had watched their only daughter disappear into Henderson Hall with a mixture of pride and apprehension. She was their miracle child born after years of trying and 3 heartbreaking miscarriages. Jessica was the center of their universe, and letting her go felt like releasing a piece of their souls into the unknown. Jessica had chosen to major in journalism, drawn by stories she'd read about intrepid reporters, uncovering corruption and giving voice to the voiceless. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that masked an innate shyness, and those who knew her described a young woman of unusual depth and perception. Her roommate, Amanda Pierce, would later tell investigators that Jessica had an almost uncanny ability to read people, to sense things others missed. It was this very intuition that would prove both a blessing and a curse in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The semester had started normally enough. Jessica threw herself into her studies with characteristic determination, quickly earning the respect of her professors and the friendship of several classmates. She joined the campus newspaper, the Millbrook Monitor, where her sharp writing and tireless work ethic made her a standout among the staff. Her editor, Professor William Garrett, would later describe her as one of the most promising student journalists he'd encountered in his 20-year career. But as October gave way to November, those closest to Jessica began to notice subtle changes. She became more withdrawn, more watchful. She started looking over her shoulder when walking across campus, and Amanda noticed that Jessica had begun keeping their dorm room door locked, even when they were inside, something that had never been necessary before. When pressed about her growing anxiety, Jessica would offer vague explanations about feeling watched or sensing that something wasn't right. She mentioned receiving strange phone calls where no one would speak, just the sound of breathing on the other end before the line went dead. Amanda assumed it was probably a prank caller, the kind of juvenile harassment that unfortunately plagued many college campuses. She encouraged Jessica to report it to campus security, but Jessica seemed reluctant to make a formal complaint. What Amanda didn't know, what no one knew until the diary was discovered, was that these incidents were far from random, and they were escalating in ways that terrified Jessica. November 2nd, 1996, fell on a Saturday. The weather had turned cold, with the first hint of winter sharp in the air, and a light frost that made the campus pathways treacherous in the early morning hours. It was the night of the annual Sigma Chi Harvest Moon Party, one of the semester's biggest social events, held at an off-campus house on Maple Street that the fraternity rented for such occasions. Jessica had initially been reluctant to attend. Amanda would later tell police that her roommate had seemed increasingly nervous about going to large gatherings, claiming she felt exposed in crowds. But Amanda, concerned about her friend's growing isolation, had convinced Jessica that a night out might help lift her spirits and provide a much-needed distraction from whatever was troubling her. The party was in full swing by the time Jessica and Amanda arrived around 9 o'clock. The three-story Victorian house pulsed with music that could be heard from blocks away, and students spilled out onto the wraparound porch and into the yard, red plastic cups in hand, their laughter carrying on the crisp night air. Jack-o'-lanterns, left over from Halloween just 2 days earlier, grinned menacingly from the porch steps, their candles casting dancing shadows across the faces of revelers. Security footage from a nearby convenience store, recovered during the initial investigation, would later show Jessica and Amanda walking past the building at approximately 8:47 p.m., both bundled in winter coats, Jessica carrying her signature worn leather purse that contained her student ID, exactly $23 in cash, and the keys to her dorm room. For the first hour, witnesses reported, Jessica seemed to relax and enjoy herself. She was seen talking with several classmates from her journalism program, nursing a beer, and even laughing at something her friend Michael Torres had said. Torres, who had harbored a quiet crush on Jessica since September, would later tell investigators that she seemed almost like her old self during those early moments of the party. But something changed around 10:30. Multiple witnesses would later report seeing Jessica suddenly grow pale and agitated, while standing near the makeshift bar set up in the kitchen. She had been in the middle of a conversation with Torres and 2 other students when she suddenly stopped talking mid-sentence, her face draining of color as her eyes fixed on something or someone across the room. She just went completely still, Torres would tell police, like she'd seen a ghost or something. I turned to look where she was looking, but it was so crowded I couldn't tell what had spooked her. Amanda, who had been in the backyard talking to friends, didn't witness this moment. By the time she returned to the main party area, Jessica had already disappeared into the crowd. Amanda spent the next 20 minutes looking for her roommate, eventually enlisting the help of other friends in the search. They combed through every room of the house, checked the basement, the attic, even the small shed in the backyard where some students had gone to smoke cigarettes away from the main group. Jessica was nowhere to be found. At first, Amanda wasn't overly concerned. College parties were chaotic affairs, and it wasn't uncommon for people to slip away without notice. She assumed Jessica might have felt overwhelmed, and decided to walk back to the dorm alone, something that, in retrospect, she would forever regret not preventing. It wasn't until Amanda returned to Henderson Hall around 1:30 in the morning and found their room empty that real worry set in. Jessica's keys were missing, but all of her personal belongings remained untouched. Her backpack sat on her desk exactly where she'd left it. Her wallet, containing her driver's license and bank cards, lay on her dresser. Most telling of all, her contact lens case sat open on the bathroom counter, something Jessica would never have left behind, as she was virtually blind without her contacts and had only one spare pair. Amanda spent the remainder of the night calling Jessica's friends, checking with the front desk to see if she'd asked to be let into the room, and walking the halls hoping to find her curled up in a study lounge somewhere. As dawn broke over the campus, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that should have been beautiful but instead felt ominous, Amanda made the call that would change everything. At 6:42 a.m. on Sunday, November 3rd, 1996, she dialed. The initial response from both campus security and the local police was measured, even cautious. Missing person reports involving college students were common, particularly after parties, and the vast majority resolved themselves within 24 hours when the missing student returned, usually hungover and embarrassed, from an unplanned overnight adventure. Detective Raymond Kowalski, a 15-year veteran of the Millbrook Police Department who caught the case, approached the investigation with the methodical thoroughness that had made him one of the department's most respected investigators. He began by interviewing Amanda and the other students who had last seen Jessica at the party, slowly piecing together a timeline of her final known hours. What emerged was troubling, though not entirely unusual. Jessica had been seen leaving the party around 10:45 p.m., approximately 15 minutes after the incident that had caused her to go pale. Several witnesses reported seeing her walk quickly toward the front door, her head down, apparently trying to avoid drawing attention to herself. No one had seen her actually leave the house, and crucially, no one had seen her with anyone else. The walk from the Maple Street house back to Henderson Hall was approximately 6 blocks through a relatively safe part of town. The route took students past several well-lit intersections and a 24-hour diner that was popular with the college crowd. Detective Kowalski and his team canvassed every business along the route, hoping to find someone who had seen Jessica walking home alone. They found nothing. The investigation expanded rapidly over the following days. Jessica's parents made the agonizing drive from Cedar Falls, their worst fears confirmed when they saw their daughter's untouched dorm room. Thomas Holloway, a quiet man who managed a farm supply store, stood in the doorway of room 314 with tears streaming down his face, while Linda clutched Jessica's favorite sweater to her chest as if it might somehow bring her daughter back. Search teams combed through every inch of the campus and the surrounding areas. Volunteers from the university community joined professional search and rescue teams, creating a small army of people who spread out across fields, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings, calling Jessica's name until their voices grew hoarse. Helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights cutting through the November darkness as they scanned the landscape for any sign of the missing girl. The media attention was intense and immediate. By Thursday, November 7th, Jessica's story had been picked up by regional news outlets, and by the following week, national cable news programs were running segments about the Millbrook mystery. Her photograph, a smiling portrait from her high school yearbook, became one of the most recognizable images in the Midwest. Yet despite the massive search effort, the media coverage, and the dedication of law enforcement, no trace of Jessica Holloway was found. No witnesses came forward with credible sightings. No physical evidence emerged from the party house or the route she would have taken back to campus. It was as if she had simply vanished into the Ohio night, leaving behind nothing but questions and a growing sense of dread that settled over the university community like a shroud. 27 years later, as construction workers used sledgehammers to demolish the interior walls of Henderson Hall, one of them noticed something unusual embedded in the plaster of room 3. The worker, Jose Martinez, had been tasked with salvaging any valuable materials before the building's complete demolition, when his hammer struck something that didn't sound like wood or metal. Curious, Martinez carefully chiseled away the surrounding plaster until he could extract what appeared to be a plastic bag containing a book. The bag, despite its age, had protected its contents remarkably well. Inside was a brown leather diary with property of Jessica Marie Holloway, written in careful cursive on the inside cover. Martinez, unaware of the significance of his discovery, initially planned to throw the diary away with the other debris. It was only when his supervisor, who had been working at the university long enough to remember the disappearance, saw the name that they realized what they had found. Within hours, the diary was in the hands of the current lead detective on the cold case, Detective Maria Santos, who had reopened Jessica's file just 6 months earlier as part of a department-wide review of unsolved cases. The diary's contents would prove to be both illuminating and deeply disturbing. The entries began in early September 1996, filled with the typical observations and excitement of a college freshman. Jessica wrote about her classes, her growing friendship with Amanda, her hopes for her career in journalism. But as the weeks progressed, the tone of the entries began to shift, becoming increasingly anxious and paranoid. The first troubling entry was dated October. Someone was in our room today while Amanda and I were at class. I know this sounds crazy, but I can tell. My books were moved just slightly, but enough that I noticed. My desk drawer was opened a different amount than I left it. Amanda thinks I'm imagining things, but I'm not. Someone was here. The entries that followed documented a pattern of subtle harassment that escalated throughout October. Jessica wrote about her growing certainty that someone was following her around campus, always staying just far enough away that she could never get a clear look at them. She described finding notes slipped under her door, notes that contained no threatening language, but somehow felt menacing in their very existence. The notes, according to her diary, contained random observations about her daily routine, what she wore to class, what she ordered at the campus cafeteria, which library carol she preferred for studying. Most chilling of all were the entries describing the phone calls. What Amanda had assumed were random prank calls were, according to Jessica's detailed observations, anything but random. The calls came at specific times, always when Amanda was out of the room, and the breathing on the other end had a particular rhythm that Jessica had learned to recognize. She wrote about trying to trace the calls through the campus phone system but hitting dead ends at every turn. By late October, Jessica's entries revealed a young woman living in a state of constant fear. She wrote about changing her daily routines, taking different routes to class, even considering transferring to another school just to escape whatever was happening to her. She had begun to suspect that her stalker was someone with access to campus facilities, someone who could move freely through the dormitories and academic buildings without arousing suspicion. The final entry in the diary was dated November 1st, 1996, just one day before her disappearance. I know who it is now. I can't believe I was so blind. The signs were all there, and I chose to ignore them, because I didn't want to believe it could be someone I trusted. But I have proof now. Photographs I took yesterday when I finally caught him following me. I'm scared to go to the police because who would believe me? But I can't live like this anymore. I'm going to front him tomorrow night at the party. Amanda will be there, and there will be lots of people around, so he can't try anything. I'm going to end this once and for all. But Jessica never identified her stalker in writing. The diary ended there, its secrets buried in plaster and time, leaving investigators with more questions than answers about what had happened to the frightened young woman who had hidden her deepest fears between the walls of room 3. Detective Santos closed the diary and leaned back in her chair, the weight of the discovery settling over her like a physical presence. After 27 years, Jessica Holloway had finally spoken from beyond whatever fate had claimed her, but her words, rather than providing closure, had opened a new and far more disturbing chapter in a case that had never truly been closed. The photographs Jessica mentioned, the proof she claimed to have, were nowhere to be found. Her camera, a disposable Kodak model her parents had given her for college, had never been recovered. But somewhere in the files and evidence boxes that had accumulated over nearly 3 decades of investigation, Santos believed, lay the answers to questions that were about to take on new and urgent significance. The diary's discovery would soon send shockwaves through the quiet university town, reopening old wounds and raising new questions about what had really happened on that cold November night in More importantly, it would force investigators to take a fresh look at everyone who had been close to Jessica during those final terrifying weeks of her life. Because according to her own words, Jessica Holloway hadn't vanished at the hands of a random stranger. She had been stalked, terrorized, and ultimately silenced by someone she knew and trusted, someone who had been hiding in plain sight for 27 years. The hunt for Jessica's killer was about to begin all over again. Detective Maria Santos had been working cold cases for 8 years, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of Jessica Holloway's diary in her hands. As she sat in the fluorescent-lit evidence room of the Millbrook Police Department, surrounded by boxes that chronicled nearly 3 decades of dead ends and false leads, the leather-bound journal seemed to pulse with the urgency of its young author's fear. Santos was a methodical investigator, known for her ability to see patterns that others missed. She had reopened Jessica's case 6 months earlier as part of a department initiative to review unsolved disappearances using modern forensic techniques. What she had expected to be a routine cold case review had just become the most significant lead in the investigation's history. The diary changed everything. It transformed Jessica from a victim of random violence into a young woman who had been systematically terrorized by someone she knew, someone who had successfully hidden their identity for 27 years. More disturbing still was the realization that if Jessica's stalker was still alive, they had been living among the Millbrook community all this time, carrying the secret of what had happened to her. Santos began by re-examining every piece of evidence with fresh eyes. But first, she needed to understand who Jessica had become in those final weeks of her life. The diary revealed a far more complex picture than the original investigation had uncovered. The first person Santos contacted was Amanda Pierce, now Amanda Pierce Williams, who had built a successful career as a pediatric nurse in Columbus. When Santos reached her by phone, Amanda's voice immediately tightened at the mention of Jessica's name. "I have never stopped thinking about her," Amanda said, her words carrying 27 years of guilt and grief. "Not a single day has gone by that I haven't wondered if I could have done something different." They met at a coffee shop in Columbus on a gray December morning. Amanda, now 45, carried the weight of her memories in the lines around her eyes and the careful way she chose her words. She had married, raised 3 children, and built a life that looked complete from the outside. But Jessica's disappearance remained an open wound that had never quite healed. She was scared those last few weeks, Amanda told Santos, stirring her coffee absently. "But I thought it was just freshman anxiety, you know. The adjustment to college, being away from home for the first time. I had no idea it was something real, something dangerous." Santos showed Amanda photocopies of relevant diary entries, watching as the woman's face grew pale, reading Jessica's own words about the subtle harassment she had endured. "She never told me about the notes," Amanda whispered, "or about someone being in our room. Why didn't she tell me?" It was a question that would haunt Santos throughout the investigation. Jessica's diary revealed a young woman increasingly isolated by her fear, unable to trust even her closest friend with the full extent of what was happening to her. The stalker had succeeded in making Jessica feel completely alone, even when surrounded by people who cared about her. Amanda provided Santos with a list of everyone in Jessica's social circle during the fall of 1996. Classmates, professors, staff members at the campus newspaper, students from her dorm floor. Some names Santos recognized from the original investigation files, but others had never been properly interviewed. The passage of time had allowed certain leads to slip through the cracks, and Santos was determined not to let that happen again. Professor William Garrett was 71 years old now, long retired from his position at the Millbrook Monitor, but his memory of Jessica remained sharp. Santos found him at his modest home on the outskirts of town, surrounded by towers of newspapers and journalism awards that spoke to a distinguished career. Jessica was extraordinary, Garrett said, settling into his favorite armchair with the careful movements of advanced age. She had an instinct for story, for finding the truth that others missed. In 40 years of teaching, I maybe encountered 5 students with that kind of raw talent. Santos pressed him for details about Jessica's work at the newspaper during those final weeks. Garrett's expression grew thoughtful, and he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "There was something she was working on," he said slowly. "A story she seemed excited about, but also nervous. She asked me about the ethics of investigating someone you know personally. I told her that journalism sometimes requires difficult choices, but that the truth should always come first." This was new information, not mentioned in any of the original police reports. Santos felt her pulse quicken as she pressed for more details. Did she tell you what the story was about? Garrett shook his head. She was secretive about it, which wasn't like her. Jessica usually loved to bounce ideas off me, to get feedback on her leads. But this one she kept close to her chest. She said she wasn't ready to talk about it yet, that she needed more evidence first. The timing aligned perfectly with Jessica's diary entries about gathering proof of her stalker's identity. Santos began to suspect that Jessica's journalism instincts had kicked in during her final weeks, that she had been investigating her own harassment, perhaps planning to expose her tormentor through the campus newspaper. Did she have access to a dark room? Santos asked, thinking of the photographs Jessica had mentioned taking. Of course, Garrett replied. All the journalism students did. We had a full photography lab in the basement of the communications building. Jessica had learned to develop her own film just that semester. Santos made a mental note to check whether any undeveloped film or photographs had been found in the communications building after Jessica's disappearance. The original investigation had focused primarily on her dorm room and the party house. But if Jessica had been conducting her own investigation, she might have hidden evidence in places that hadn't been thoroughly searched. The Victorian house on Maple Street, where the Sigma Chi party had taken place, was still standing, though it had changed hands several times over the years. Santos obtained permission from the current owners, a young family who had no knowledge of its connection to Jessica's disappearance, to conduct a thorough search of the property. Using ground-penetrating radar and other modern techniques unavailable in 1996, Santos and her team spent 3 days examining every inch of the house and yard. They found nothing directly related to Jessica, but the exercise helped Santos better understand the layout of the building and the numerous places someone could have hidden or observed the party without being seen. More importantly, Santos began tracking down every person who had attended the party that night. The original investigation had interviewed the obvious suspects, Jessica's close friends, the fraternity members who had hosted the event, and anyone who had been seen talking to her during the evening. But Santos cast a wider net, using social media and public records to locate people who had simply been present that night but hadn't been considered significant witnesses. It was through this expanded canvassing that Santos discovered something troubling. Several people who should have been at the party claimed they hadn't attended at all. Michael Torres, who had harbored feelings for Jessica and was one of the last people to speak with her before she disappeared, now worked as an accountant in Cleveland. When Santos contacted him, his memory of that night remained vivid and consistent with his original statement to police. She just changed, Torres told Santos during a phone interview. One minute we were laughing about something stupid, and the next minute she looked like she'd seen a ghost. Her face went completely white, and she was staring across the room like someone had just walked in who terrified her. Santos pressed him for details about who else had been in the room at that moment, but Torres could only provide general descriptions. The party had been crowded, and people had been moving around constantly. However, he did remember that Jessica's reaction had been immediate and visceral, not the gradual recognition of someone familiar, but the instant, overwhelming fear of someone she definitely knew but absolutely didn't want to see. One name that kept appearing in Santos's investigation was David Fleming, who had worked as a resident advisor in Henderson Hall during the 1996-97 academic year. Fleming had been 24 at the time, a graduate student pursuing a master's degree in psychology while earning money by supervising undergraduates in the dormitory. Fleming had been mentioned peripherally in the original investigation. Several students had reported seeing him around the building during the days following Jessica's disappearance, and he had provided a statement to police, indicating that he had noticed nothing unusual about Jessica's behavior in the weeks before she vanished. But when Santos attempted to locate Fleming for a follow-up interview, she discovered something alarming. David Fleming seemed to have vanished from all public records shortly after completing his degree in May. There was no trace of him in employment records, no social media presence, no voter registration, no property ownership. It was as if he had deliberately erased himself from public life immediately after Jessica's disappearance. Santos had seen this kind of pattern before. It often indicated someone with something serious to hide. Working with the university's alumni office, Santos was able to track down Fleming's thesis advisor, Dr. Patricia Novak, who was still teaching in the psychology department. Dr. Novak remembered Fleming clearly, though her recollections were troubling. David was brilliant, Dr. Novak told Santos during a meeting in her cluttered office. His thesis focused on stalking behavior and obsession patterns. He was particularly interested in how stalkers could maintain long-term surveillance of their targets without detection. The coincidence was chilling. Jessica had been stalked for weeks by someone who seemed to know her routines intimately, someone with access to her dormitory, someone who could observe her without being noticed. David Fleming had not only been in a position to do all of these things, but he had been academically studying the very behaviors that had terrorized Jessica during her final weeks. "Did you notice any unusual behavior from David during that fall semester?" Santos asked. Dr. Novak was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "There were some concerns," she admitted finally. David had become increasingly focused on his research, almost obsessively so. He would spend hours in the library reading about criminal psychology, particularly cases involving young women. His thesis advisor meetings became uncomfortable. He seemed to be studying these cases, not just academically, but with a personal interest that crossed professional boundaries. Santos felt a chill run down her spine. "Did you report these concerns to anyone?" "I should have," Dr. Novak said quietly. "But David was a graduate student, and we gave them considerable latitude in their research interests. It wasn't until after that poor girl disappeared that I started to wonder if his interest in stalking behavior was purely academic." Armed with new information about Jessica's potential journalistic investigation and David Fleming's suspicious behavior, Santos obtained a warrant to search the basement archives of the communications building. The photography lab had been renovated several times since 1996, but university maintenance records showed that a storage room containing old equipment and supplies had remained largely untouched for decades. Santos and two technicians spent hours searching through boxes of old photographs, contact sheets, and undeveloped film canisters. Most of the material was routine student work, portraits, campus events, experimental artistic shots, typical of college photography classes. But in a box labeled Fall 1996, Unclaimed Materials, Santos discovered something that made her pulse race: a roll of undeveloped 35mm film with J. Holloway, written on the canister in Jessica's distinctive handwriting. The film was developed using special techniques designed to maximize the chances of recovering images from aged stock. Of the 36 exposures on the roll, 28 were completely black, damaged by time and improper storage. But 8 photographs had survived, and what they showed sent shockwaves through the investigation. The images showed a figure following Jessica across campus, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. The shots were grainy and the lighting poor, but they clearly documented someone maintaining surveillance of Jessica over several different days. The stalker stayed far enough away that facial identification was impossible, but certain details were visible: a dark winter coat, a distinctive backpack, and most importantly, a campus ID badge hanging from a lanyard. The photographs proved Jessica's diary entries had been accurate. She had indeed been systematically followed and had managed to document some of her stalker's activities. More significantly, the presence of the campus ID badge suggested her tormentor was not a stranger, but someone with official access to university facilities. Santos immediately sent the photographs to the FBI's Image Enhancement Unit, hoping that modern digital techniques might be able to extract additional details that could lead to identification. While waiting for those results, she continued investigating David Fleming's mysterious disappearance. Fleming's vanishing act had been thorough but not perfect. Santos discovered that he had maintained contact with his elderly mother in Michigan until her death in 2003. sending her brief letters from various cities across the country but never including a return address. The letters, which Santos obtained through the mother's estate papers, painted a picture of a man living a deliberately transient lifestyle. But Fleming had made one crucial mistake. In 2018, he had applied for a passport renewal, a process that required him to provide his social security number and current address. The application had been filed from Portland, Oregon under the name David Michael Fleming, and Santos was able to confirm that he was still living in the Pacific Northwest under his real name. The discovery that Fleming was not only alive but locatable sent a jolt of adrenaline through Santos. After 27 years, she was about to come face to face with someone who had been in Jessica's dormitory during her final weeks, who had studied stalking behavior, and who had disappeared immediately after completing his degree in. Santos coordinated with Portland police to conduct surveillance of Fleming's last known address, a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood where he apparently lived alone and worked as a night security guard. The irony was not lost on Santos that a man suspected of stalking a college student had spent decades working in security, with access to buildings and surveillance systems. But before Santos could arrange to interview Fleming, her investigation took an unexpected turn that would shake her confidence in everything she thought she knew about Jessica's disappearance. The FBI's Image Enhancement Unit returned the photographs with results that were both helpful and deeply unsettling. Using advanced digital techniques, they had managed to extract additional details from the grainy surveillance shots Jessica had taken of her stalker. The enhanced images revealed something that changed the entire direction of the investigation. The figure following Jessica was clearly shorter and more slightly built than David Fleming's description in university records. More significantly, a partially visible logo on the stalker's backpack matched those used by the campus bookstore bags that were commonly carried by students, not graduate student staff members. Jessica's stalker had not been David Fleming. Despite the suspicious timing of his disappearance and his academic interest in stalking behavior, her tormentor had been a fellow student, someone young enough and innocuous enough to blend in seamlessly with the campus population. Santos felt a mixture of relief and frustration. While she was glad not to have spent months pursuing an innocent man who had simply chosen to live a private life after graduation, she was back to square one in terms of identifying Jessica's stalker. But the enhanced photographs provided one more crucial piece of information. In the background of one shot, taken near the library, part of a campus bulletin board was visible. The enhanced image revealed a flyer advertising the Sigma Chi Harvest Moon Party, the very party where Jessica would disappear 3 days later. The timeline was becoming clear. Jessica had documented her stalker's activities right up until the end, gathering evidence that she planned to use to expose them. She had mentioned in her diary that she intended to confront her tormentor at the party, believing that the public setting would provide safety. Instead, it had provided the perfect opportunity for her stalker to silence her forever. A chilling realization. As Santos pored over the enhanced photographs and Jessica's diary entries, a disturbing pattern emerged. Jessica's stalker had not been randomly targeting her. They had been studying her, learning her routines, observing her responses to the harassment. The notes slipped under her door, the phone calls, the sense of being watched, all of it had been calculated to create maximum psychological impact. This was not the work of an impulsive predator or a crime of opportunity. Jessica had been carefully selected and systematically terrorized by someone who understood exactly how to break down her defenses while remaining invisible to everyone around her. The sophistication of the stalking campaign suggested someone with knowledge of psychology, someone who understood how to manipulate fear without leaving obvious evidence. It also suggested someone who knew Jessica well enough to predict her responses and exploit her vulnerabilities. Santos began to suspect that Jessica's stalker had not been a random student, but someone who had specifically sought her out, perhaps someone who had been watching her from the very beginning of the semester. The question was, what had made Jessica Holloway a target? As Santos prepared to expand her investigation beyond David Fleming and into the broader population of students who had attended Millbrook University in 1996, she received a phone call that would change everything. The call came from Dr. Patricia Novak, the psychology professor who had supervised David Fleming's thesis research. Her voice was shaking as she spoke, and Santos could immediately tell that something had deeply upset the elderly academic. "Detective Santos," Dr. Novak said, her words coming quickly as if she were afraid she might lose her nerve. "I need to tell you something about David Fleming's research. Something I should have mentioned before, but I wasn't sure if it was relevant." Santos felt her pulse quicken. "What is it, Dr. Novak?" David wasn't the only graduate student working on stalking research that semester, she said. There was another student, someone who was even more obsessed with the topic than David was, someone who had specifically requested Jessica Holloway as a research subject. The words hit Santos like a physical blow. Jessica hadn't just been randomly selected by her stalker, she had been chosen as part of a twisted academic research project, a real-life experiment in psychological terror conducted by someone who should have been protecting her. Who was the other student? Santos asked, though she somehow already knew that the answer would upend everything she thought she understood about Jessica's disappearance. Dr. Novak's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Someone who's still here, detective. Someone who never left Millbrook University. Someone who has been walking these halls for 27 years, knowing exactly what happened to Jessica Holloway. This is part 3 of the true crime story. I need to reveal the shocking identity of Jessica's stalker. 2. Explain the twisted academic experiment. 3. Build to a climactic confrontation. 4. Provide resolution while maintaining the dark cinematic tone. 5. Keep it around 4,000. 6. Maintain historical accuracy. 7. Avoid the prohibited names: Sarah, Chen, Blackwood, Marcus, Rodriguez. 8. Make it emotionally satisfying while staying true to the mystery thriller genre. Key elements to resolve. Who was the other graduate student Dr. Novak mentioned? How did the academic research connect to Jessica's stalking? What happened at the party that night? Where is Jessica now, alive, dead? Will there be justice? I should create a shocking but believable reveal. Someone who has been hiding in plain sight at the university for 27 years. The academic research angle gives this a particularly chilling dimension, that Jessica was essentially a lab rat in someone's twisted psychological experiment. The tone should remain dark and cinematic, building to a satisfying but perhaps somewhat ambiguous conclusion that fits the true crime genre. Detective Maria Santos gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles white against the black plastic. Dr. Patricia Novak's words echoed in her mind like a death knell. Someone who's still here. Someone who never left Millbrook University. "Dr. Novak," Santos said carefully, "I need you to tell me everything. Right now." The elderly psychology professor's breathing was ragged on the other end of the line. Her name was Dr. Catherine Wells. She was a doctoral candidate then, working on her dissertation about the psychological impact of sustained surveillance on young women. She had specifically requested permission to study female college freshmen as part of her research. Santos felt the blood drain from her face. A doctoral candidate would have had access to student records, dormitory buildings, campus facilities, everything Jessica's stalker would have needed to conduct their campaign of terror. More chilling still, if this person had been conducting research, Jessica's stalking hadn't been personal. She had been nothing more than a test subject in someone's twisted academic experiment. "Is Dr. Wells still at the university?" Santos asked, though something in Dr. Novak's tone had already suggested the answer. "She's Dr. Catherine Wells Morrison now. She completed her doctorate in 1997 and was hired as an assistant professor that same year. She's been here ever since, detective. She's now the head of our criminal psychology program." The revelation hit Santos like a physical blow. For 27 years, Jessica Holloway's killer had been walking the halls of Millbrook University, teaching students about criminal behavior while hiding her own monstrous crime. She had built an entire career on the foundation of murder, rising through the academic ranks while Jessica's family lived in agony, never knowing what had happened to their daughter. Santos immediately called for backup and began coordinating with university security to locate Dr. Wells Morrison. But as her team mobilized, Santos couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. Someone who had successfully hidden a murder for nearly 3 decades would not be caught off guard easily. Dr. Catherine Wells Morrison's office was located in the psychology building, just 4 blocks from where Henderson Hall had stood before its demolition. At 52 years old, she was considered one of the university's most distinguished faculty members, a published expert on criminal psychology who had consulted on numerous high-profile cases throughout her career. Her academic credentials were impeccable. A doctoral dissertation on predatory surveillance patterns in urban environments, published research on stalking behavior, and a textbook on criminal psychology that was used in universities across the country. She had testified as an expert witness in dozens of criminal trials, helping prosecutors understand the minds of killers and predators. The irony was sickening. Jessica's murderer had built a career studying the very crimes she had committed, positioning herself as an expert on behaviors she had personally engaged in. Every lecture she had given, every paper she had published, every student she had taught, all of it had been tainted by the knowledge of what she had done to an innocent 18-year-old girl. Santos arrived at the psychology building with a team of officers, expecting to find Dr. Wells Morrison in her office preparing for afternoon classes. Instead, they found the office empty, with signs that someone had left in a hurry. Desk drawers hung open, papers were scattered across the floor, and a computer monitor still glowed with an email program that had been left running. The most recent email in the inbox was from Dr. Patricia Novak, sent just 20 minutes earlier, with the subject line, "Urgent, police contact." Dr. Wells Morrison had been warned that her secret was about to be exposed, and she had fled. But she hadn't been careful enough in her haste. Among the scattered papers on her office floor, Santos discovered something that made her pulse race. A manila folder labeled JH Research Subject Alpha in precise handwriting. Inside the folder were dozens of photographs of Jessica Holloway, taken throughout September and October of 1996, without her knowledge. The images showed Jessica walking to class, studying in the library, eating in the cafeteria, talking with friends, an intimate surveillance record that documented nearly every moment of her daily life during those final weeks. But the photographs were just the beginning. The folder also contained detailed behavioral analysis notes, written with the cold precision of a clinical researcher studying a laboratory animal. Wells Morrison had documented Jessica's responses to each escalation of harassment, noting how the phone calls affected her sleep patterns, how the mysterious notes changed her daily routines, how the sensation of being watched gradually broke down her psychological defenses. Most disturbing of all was a section labeled Subject Termination Protocol, which outlined plans for Jessica's murder with the same detached academic tone used throughout the rest of the research notes. As Santos read through Dr. Wells Morrison's meticulous documentation of her crime, the events of November 2nd, 1996, finally began to make sense. Jessica had not been randomly targeted or killed in a moment of passion. Her murder had been the planned culmination of a months-long psychological experiment designed to study the effects of sustained terror on a human subject. According to the research notes, Dr. Wells Morrison had attended the Sigma Chi party that night, waiting for the moment when Jessica would spot her and realize that her stalker was someone she had trusted, someone she had probably confided in about her fears, without realizing she was speaking to the very person who had been terrorizing her. The notes described how Dr. Wells Morrison had positioned herself across the room from Jessica, waiting for that moment of recognition. When Jessica suddenly went pale and fled the party, It was because she had finally seen her tormentor's face and understood the full scope of the deception that had been perpetrated against her. Dr. Wells Morrison had followed Jessica from the party, catching up with her somewhere along the 6-block route back to Henderson Hall. The research notes described this as the final data collection phase, though they were vague about the specific details of what had happened next. What was clear was that Jessica Holloway had never made it back to her dormitory that night. She had died somewhere in the darkness between the party house and campus, killed by someone who had studied her like a laboratory specimen, and then discarded her when the experiment was complete. But the research notes didn't reveal where Jessica's body had been disposed of, information that Santos desperately needed to bring closure to the Holloway family and ensure that Dr. Wells Morrison faced justice for her crime. Santos immediately issued a bolo alert for Dr. Catherine Wells Morrison, providing her description and vehicle information to law enforcement agencies across Ohio and neighboring states. The professor had a 40-minute head start, but Santos hoped that would not be enough time for her to disappear entirely. While coordinating the manhunt, Santos also began searching Dr. Wells Morrison's office and university records for any clue about where Jessica's body might have been hidden. The research notes suggested that the killer had planned for body disposal as part of her termination protocol, but the specific location was not documented. Santos was examining Dr. Wells Morrison's academic calendar from 1996, when she noticed something significant. The professor had taken a personal leave day on November 4, 1996, just 2 days after Jessica's disappearance. According to university records, she had cited a family emergency as the reason for her absence, but Santos now suspected this had been when Dr. Wells Morrison disposed of Jessica's remains. The question was where. Dr. Wells Morrison would have needed somewhere private, somewhere she could work undisturbed, somewhere that would keep Jessica's body hidden for nearly 3 decades. Santos began mapping out possible locations within driving distance of the university, focusing on areas that Dr. Wells Morrison would have had access to in November: rural properties, abandoned buildings, construction sites that existed in 1996 but had since been developed anywhere a doctoral student might have been able to hide a body without attracting attention. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Dr. Wells Morrison's tax records. Santos discovered that the professor's family had owned a small hunting cabin in the Appalachian foothills about an hour south of Millbrook, property that had been in the Wells family for 3 generations. According to county records, the cabin had been primarily used during hunting season, sitting empty for most of the year. In November 1996, it would have been the perfect place for Dr. Wells Morrison to complete her gruesome research project without fear of discovery. Santos coordinated with the county sheriff's department to approach the cabin, though she suspected they would find it as empty as Dr. Wells Morrison's office had been. The professor had demonstrated careful planning throughout her crime, and Santos doubted she would flee to such an obvious location. But as the joint task force made its way along the winding mountain road toward the Wells family cabin, Santos received a call that changed everything. Dr. Wells Morrison had not fled. Instead, she had done something that would haunt Santos for the rest of her career. The call came from Dr. Patricia Novak, whose voice was shaking with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Detective Santos," she said, "Catherine just called me. She wants to meet with you. She says she's ready to tell you what happened to Jessica Holloway." Santos felt a chill run down her spine. "Where does she want to meet?" "Henderson Hall," Dr. Novak replied. "Or what's left of it. She's waiting for you in the ruins." The demolition of Henderson Hall had been halted when Jessica's diary was discovered, leaving the building partially destroyed, its interior walls reduced to rubble while its brick exterior shell remained intact. At dusk on that December evening, the ruins looked like the skeleton of some massive creature, its empty window frames staring out at the campus like hollow eye sockets. Santos approached the building with a team of officers, their flashlights cutting through the gathering darkness as they searched for any sign of Dr. Wells Morrison. The professor's car was parked outside, but the building itself seemed empty, filled only with the debris of demolition and the echo of footsteps on broken concrete. They found her in what had once been room 314, Jessica's room, standing among the rubble where the diary had been discovered just weeks earlier. Dr. Catherine Wells Morrison looked older than her 52 years, her academic composure finally cracked by the weight of 27 years of secrets. "I have been waiting for this day," she said quietly as Santos and her team surrounded her. "I have been waiting for someone to find what I hid in these walls." Santos kept her weapon trained on the professor, while officers moved to secure the area. "Dr. Wells Morrison, you are under arrest for the murder of Jessica Holloway. You have the right to remain silent." "I don't want to remain silent," she interrupted. "I have been silent for 27 years. Jessica deserves better than silence." As Santos continued the Miranda warning, Dr. Wells Morrison stared at the spot where Jessica's diary had been found, her expression a mixture of regret and something that might have been relief. "She was so perfect for the research," she said, almost to herself. "Young, trusting, isolated from her family. I thought I could control every variable, document every response. But I underestimated her intelligence, her determination to fight back." Santos felt sick listening to the casual way Dr. Wells Morrison discussed Jessica as a research subject rather than a human being. "Where is her body?" she demanded. Dr. Wells Morrison looked directly at Santos for the first time. "That's what I'm here to tell you. Jessica deserves to be found. Her parents deserve to know what happened to their daughter." As crime scene technicians documented the area and additional officers secured the perimeter, Dr. Wells Morrison began to tell the story she had kept hidden for 27 years. Her voice was flat, clinical, as if she were delivering an academic lecture rather than confessing to murder. She described the months of planning that had preceded Jessica's stalking, the careful selection process that had led her to choose Jessica as her research subject. Jessica had fit her criteria perfectly, a freshman from a small town, living away from family for the first time, naturally trusting and unlikely to immediately suspect someone in a position of authority. The stalking campaign had been designed as a controlled experiment to study the breakdown of psychological defenses under sustained pressure. Wells Morrison had documented every phase from the initial surveillance to the escalating harassment, treating Jessica's terror as data points in an academic study. But she started fighting back. Dr. Wells Morrison said, her composure beginning to crack. She started investigating, taking photographs, gathering evidence. She was going to expose the research, ruin everything I had worked for. The confession continued with the events of November 2nd. Dr. Wells Morrison had attended the party specifically to observe Jessica's response to seeing her stalker in a social setting. When Jessica fled in terror, the professor had followed, catching up with her on a dark stretch of road between the party house and campus. "I didn't plan to kill her," Dr. Wells Morrison claimed, though Santos didn't believe a word of it. "I just wanted to stop her from talking, to convince her that no one would believe her story." But she fought back, she threatened to scream, and she trailed off, staring at the ruins around them as if seeing ghosts in the shadows. "Where did you take her body?" Santos pressed. Dr. Wells Morrison was quiet for a long moment before answering. "The old limestone quarry, about 20 miles north of here. It was flooded and abandoned even then. I weighed her down with concrete blocks from a construction site near campus." The location made terrible sense. The abandoned quarry had been a popular dumping ground for various types of waste over the years, and its deep, murky water would have preserved Jessica's remains while keeping them hidden from searchers who had focused their efforts closer to the university. "But I kept something," Dr. Wells Morrison said, reaching slowly into her jacket pocket while officers tensed around her. "Something I couldn't bring myself to throw away." She withdrew a small object and held it out to Santos, a silver necklace with a heart-shaped pendant that had belonged to Jessica. According to her parents, Jessica never took the necklace off. It had been a sweet 16 gift from her grandmother. I have carried this with me every day for 27 years, Dr. Wells Morrison said, her voice finally breaking. Every lecture I gave, every student I taught, every time I pretended to be helping solve crimes instead of committing them. Jessica has been with me through all of it. The recovery of Jessica Holloway's remains from the limestone quarry took 3 days and required specialized diving equipment to reach the bottom of the flooded pit. When her body was finally brought to the surface, Santos felt a mixture of relief and profound sadness. After 27 years, Jessica was finally coming home. The forensic examination confirmed Dr. Wells Morrison's confession. Jessica had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck with a heavy object during a struggle. The concrete blocks used to weigh down her body were traced to a construction site that had been active near the university campus in November. Dr. Catherine Wells Morrison was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and stalking. During her trial, prosecutors presented the research notes found in her office as evidence of premeditation, arguing that Jessica's murder had been planned from the beginning as the culmination of her twisted academic experiment. The defense attempted to argue that Dr. Wells Morrison had suffered a psychological break brought on by the pressure of her doctoral studies, but the careful planning and documentation of her crime made such claims difficult to support. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Dr. Wells Morrison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, she finally showed genuine emotion as Jessica's parents delivered their victim impact statements, describing 27 years of not knowing whether their daughter was alive or dead, of hoping for a phone call that would never come. "You didn't just kill our daughter," Linda Holloway said, her voice steady despite her tears. "You killed a part of us too. You stole almost 3 decades of closure, of peace, of the ability to properly grieve and move forward with our lives." Thomas Holloway was less composed. His anger and grief raw even after all these years. "You studied her like she was an animal," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "You terrorized our little girl for your own sick purposes, and then you built a career on what you learned from torturing her. There is no punishment severe enough for what you have done." Jessica Marie Holloway was laid to rest in Cedar Falls on a cold January morning in 2024, 27 years after she should have come home. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, family members, childhood friends, former classmates who had never forgotten her, and strangers who had been moved by her story. Amanda Pierce Williams delivered a eulogy that captured the essence of the friend she had lost so many years ago. "Jessica believed in justice," she said, her voice carrying across the crowded cemetery. "She believed in fighting for the truth, even when it was dangerous to do so. In the end, it was her own determination to expose her stalker that led us to the truth about what happened to her. Even in death, Jessica found a way to solve her own case." Detective Maria Santos attended the funeral, standing quietly in the back as Jessica's family finally said goodbye to their daughter. The case had changed her in ways she was still trying to understand, serving as a stark reminder that evil could hide behind any face, even one dedicated to education and the pursuit of knowledge. The psychology building at Millbrook University was renamed in Jessica's honor, and a scholarship was established for students pursuing careers in investigative journalism. Wells Morrison's research and publications were removed from academic databases, her contributions to the field of criminal psychology forever tainted by the revelation of her own criminal acts. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Jessica Holloway was the diary itself, which had finally allowed her to speak across the decades and identify her own killer. The leather-bound journal was placed in the university archives, a testament to the power of truth and the importance of never giving up hope for justice. In her final entry, Jessica had written that she was going to end her ordeal once and for all. She had been right, though not in the way she had intended. 27 years later, hidden in the walls of room 314, Jessica Holloway's words had finally brought her killer to justice and allowed her family to find peace. The case of the missing Millbrook University student was officially closed. But Jessica's legacy lived on, not as a victim, but as a young woman whose courage and determination had ultimately triumphed over the evil that tried to silence her forever.